2, 1. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mutual Knowledge. I am Gauthier Lamotte, your host, and today I have a guest who is a member of MuKn. Hello, Alexander.
Hi,
People,
Gauthier.
people meet Alexander Smart. He's the CEO of MuKn, so technically he's my direct superior. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm well. I'm well.
All right.
Excited to be here. A little nervous.
Don't worry, it'll be fine. All right,
Okay.
Alex. So, could you introduce, in a few words, the MuKn company? What is it? What does it do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, MuKn, we think we of ourselves as kind of a code foundry. Like we have a, put together a team of very, very highly skilled PhD level developers, and we're really interested in solving the hard problems in the blockchain space. Um, and a lot of our community, our development team is built around language lovers because we found that to be a skill set that's really well suited to abstracting over problems and solving low level problems by building something that's more abstract and that covers that problem and makes it so that it doesn't come up the same way.
All right. So, how did you get into the blockchain industry?
That's a great question. So my background is in law. My programming experience consists of one time writing a program on a TI-85 calculator when I was in high school. Um,
That tells something about the year you were born.
yeah, right. Um, and so I'm a lawyer by training, and I met our co-founder Francois René Rideau because he was in need of a lawyer. He was at a different startup, and things weren't going well, and he was looking to change gears. And I was at a place in my career. I had done a bunch of commercial litigation over the years. I had done some criminal defense work, always focused on litigation and conflict, the conflict side of law to that point. And when we met, we realized that kind of environment of high conflict and situations where you can't trust the other party, the other party is misbehaving or might misbehave, has so much in common with the blockchain environment that developers have to operate in. Like the security environment for blockchain, especially public blockchains, where all the code is open source.
Mhm.
And there are actual assets that if you crack somebody's system, you get the assets and you can take them. Is a place where you have to have a very security forward thought process and a process that's very inclined to thinking about how to create situations to encourage parties who don't necessarily have incentives aligned to figure out ways to align those incentives and create opportunities for them to cooperate. And we found a lot more overlap there than we expected. So after I helped him separate from his previous startup, I kept helping him, and one thing led to another, and we found we liked working together, and kind of that's how we got here. So,
Wonderful. And that was your first contact with the blockchain sector.
yeah, I mean, I had I've always been kind of like passingly interested in tech. Like, so when I met Francois because I had moved. I was new in Boston, and he was here in Boston living at the time. And I was looking to change up my law practice. I had been doing something else before I moved, and I was looking to change practice areas a bit. And my brother, this was like 2019, and my brother is in finance and had been doing some trading with crypto stuff at that point. And he was like, "You should look into blockchain stuff." So we talked about it a little bit, but I had not really dipped a toe in it at all. It was just like, that's interesting. It's high tech. I'm interested in that. Like, we'll go see what I find out. And it was literally like definitely one of the first 5 meetings I went to about blockchains when I met Francois. And
All right. And so, because you're not coming from the developer side, that's something I love to ask to people who don't come from this part. Uh,
sure.
how good, how smooth was your experience with the hands-on practice? Like, for example, a money transfer, storing or purchasing assets using a DApp? Is it
Oh,
something that when you did it for the first time,
oh no, it's
how
awful.
would you describe it?
Like it's still awful. I mean, like I can get through it, but it's awful. Like I have yet to have an experience with the tech that I've been like, oh, this was easy. Now I have had experiences where I thought this is amazing. I have had things work really well in situations that have blown me away by the capability and possibility of the tech. But the execution so far has left me wanting more, quite a bit more.
Obviously, but I love asking that question because this is for me one of the biggest problems in the sector and one of the biggest uh, things to change if we want that to become mainstream. All right, and so as a lawyer, you're experienced then in game theory and negotiation. How do you apply that in your practice as a CEO?
I mean, I think for the game theory part, like,
Or negotiation in general, because
yeah,
that's roughly the
like
same.
there's a whole bunch of different schools of negotiation. Um, and I think this is probably considered a fairly newer approach to it, but I'm certainly not like I haven't created anything new in the way I approach it. But um, essentially, I think radical like transparency is very beneficial, and it's about my approach is about sincerity and transparency. And that doesn't mean complete candor. It doesn't mean that like we have to throw every card we have on the table right at the get-go and have to tell you everything about everything. But it does mean that I work hard when I'm in a situation negotiating to be honest about where I am. And that includes like emotionally, like disclosing that I'm nervous at the beginning of this interview gives me permission to bumble, gives me permission to flub my words as I go along. And that sort of disclosure is enormously effective because it expects you, my listener, to give me some slack. I've told you that I'm not totally like, I'm not coming in like just ready to go. And that's that kind of approach of thinking about negotiation as a way to, I mean, there are certainly negotiations that are zero sum, but I don't think that's most often the case. If you draw the negotiation broadly enough, there are ways to benefit both parties, and having that perspective is enormous. It's not even about win-win solutions. It's about what one party wants from most interactions is different from what the other party wants. And so a lot of times there's no cost added in making the other party happy because there are things you can do that are literally no cost to you and deeply valued by the other party. And so it's about coming in with an openness and a sincerity and like trying to be authentic about how you approach the counterparty, both with what you need and what you can offer.
Yeah, essentially, the best negotiation is the one that doesn't lead to any form of resentment.
No, exactly. Like we want to walk away from the table with both of us as excited about what happened. You know what I mean? And that's possible. And like there's a bunch of people who are like, well, if everybody leaves upset, like that's probably okay. If everybody's like a little bit disappointed. And there's like, obviously there's some truth to that sometimes. But again, like that's not always got to be true. And there's many circumstances where it's not. So the goal should absolutely be for everyone to walk away from that table feeling like they got exactly what they wanted.
All right, and now let's ask the dirty questions.
All right.
Um, Among all the blockchain projects that you've been, looking at in your career, what are those that impressed you, that you thought of, that you regarded with high respect, saying, okay, this could change the sector?
I mean, that's a great question. The thing that I think lays over the top of the sector right now for me is that the tech is so immature still that like I feel confident that the real killer applications of it haven't. I mean, if they've been invented already, they're like in some high school kid's living room still. like, because I mean, finance is like really interesting and DeFi is really interesting, but in a sense, it's like low hanging fruit. You have, now we've invented computer money, right? What are we going to do with it? Well, we're going to do finance with it. Yeah, that's great. You know what I mean? But it's not like, it is game changing and revolutionary. And at the same time, we have a finance system. It's just that not everybody gets to play. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of restrictions about who does and how they can. And there's a lot of innovation there, but like, that's not the thing that I think is going to be the most game changing long term. So specifics, projects that I have been impressed by. Let's see. There's so many. Like, I feel like there's qualities and attributes about different systems and projects that I find really admirable. You know what I mean?
You can also tell me what impressed you in a project, like not necessarily a project specifically,
Sure.
but
Like,
the type of features that blew your mind.
yeah, like I think that like the Ethereum community's willingness to go go fast and break things is admirable. I mean, it's the Silicon Valley ethos, but like it's different when you're doing that with financial infrastructure. As a lawyer, like I think that approach works for, it is really good for throwing out these new models and evaluating them very quickly. There is obviously a downside to it. You have to be you have to have a gambler's spirit to want to play that way. The Cardano community's approach to institutionalization, I think, is really valuable. I think it's it's going to be slower to pay dividends maybe, but I think that they are really heavily invested in research. And I've heard people say, well, why are they putting so much into that? They just need to build things and see what happens with them. And that's true to a point, but like, to get real widespread adoption, either you have to throw a revolution and overthrow the elites, or you have to co-opt them, right? Like, that's the only way those are the ways to bring down a system. You either have to like light it on fire or co-opt it. And there's arguments for both under certain circumstances. But hello, Kitty.
Hi.
There is, but I think that building a portfolio of research that your project is built on is a good way to get slower movers, but more large movers. And insurance companies are going to be a lot more confident putting their money in something that has all sorts of research underlying it, and that they can turn to justify their own investors why they're doing that. And I think the community building aspect of blockchains is really fascinating. And there's some really great people at that. And there's a lot of that. So,
There are use cases that I love thinking of because they seem crazy at the moment.
mm-hmm.
And some of them seem crazy, but historically there has been cases of, very crazy projects that nobody believed in. For example, when I think of Airbnb, the hardest part was not to convince users to use Airbnb, because Airbnb is basically, okay, a hotel room is $100, and this allows me to sleep at somebody's place for $30. Okay, count me in.
Right.
But the the hardest guy to convince was the guy who was providing the apartment. Like, you're going to give your keys to somebody you don't know, and you're going to like it, and that person is even going to, just give you a reward, or at least give you a review of the apartment, and you'd better be a good service provider. And it seemed absolutely impossible. And when I was something like 17, 18, I remember the birth of a success of a romantic meeting site. I don't know what the name was at the time, but I heard many people from the old generation telling me, "Oh, you should be careful. You never know who you're going to meet on the internet. This is super dangerous."
Right.
And it wasn't evident that the success would be here, and yet here it is. And so for example, I have a question for you because you're a lawyer. I see many
Yeah.
people talking about the use case of having systems of decentralized justice, so a way to solve disputes. There are many, many different ways to solve disputes, many different algorithms and organizations, but some of them are, for example, just for property tracking to avoid paying a lawyer to testify that you are the ultimate owner of the in the chain of ownership. Do you think this, for example, would be generalized and change the work of a lawyer because this would be automatized later? Do you think that could be adopted?
I mean, the yes, there are a lot of areas in the law. Like, I mean, the thing about a blockchain technology, right, is that it's just a ledger, and the value is that it can't be censored or changed, right? And I mean, like, one of the first things that you think of is like, well, what do you want to put on that ledger? Well, things you want to know are true for a long time, things you want to have a record of that's permanent, real estate titles. That's an obvious use case. But there are a lot of like lawyers are involved in a lot of those sorts of transactions where you're like, oh, we really need to have a record of this, I think there's a huge amount of value there. And I mean, like I live in Boston, right? So in the US, I can't speak to other countries' legal systems, real estate systems at all, but in the US, like when you need to check if your title to a property is good, you have to go to a county recorder's office, and like you have to do it or pay someone to do it, and they go in and they look through the records. And like in Boston, that means like I've never been. I should go check this out myself in this office. I haven't been here, but like it's books, it's literal ledgers, like big elephant folio ledgers that record every deed exchange. And like for a city like Boston, like there are 400 years of records, and like that is not trivial to search. Like
Of course.
when you're talking like old school like library research, like go to the card file and find volume whatever on this, like it's an enormous thing. And like we would all be better off if we had a digital way to do that. There isn't one really right now. The issue with adoption for that is that like because you do have to go to the county recorder's office, you got to get every county recorder to be like, yes, we should digitize our records and we will trust. I mean, if every county just has is on a separate chain, that doesn't really help us that much, right? You still have to find the right one for every single.
Indeed.
So there's still some hurdles to it, but I do see this as really beneficial in the long run. Like you would have so much more actual security on real estate deeds if you could actually run a keyword search to track like if you think of Google's search technology applied to deeds, I feel confident it would give you a lot better security and a better peace of mind that you actually know what's out there. Because like, let's be honest, like I have very little confidence that the records from the 1700s that I found everything if I'm looking for that. You know what I mean?
Of course.
So, and I think that going to the dispute resolution things, there's all sorts of really interesting innovations and ideas. The interplay between these decentralized communities that blockchains are creating and like the centralized nations and states that are the legacy that the government is, kind of the baseline of dispute resolution for us now in large part. Like there's some real interesting interplay there. Because many of the situations where you might need to have a decider, an arbitrator, are, not necessarily people that you are interacting with outside of like just you bump into them on the street, right? So there's a set of these conflicts that don't necessarily lend themselves to this kind of like specialized, decentralized community. But of course, there are obviously large other sets of this that lend themselves really well to that. Like if you're building in one blockchain community and you have a dispute with another project that's building within that community, like there's no reason you couldn't have that dispute resolution within the community with the community weighing in on it wouldn't be effective. And like there's potential value there because people there are vested, they're interested, they care about both sides potentially, they want the right outcome.
Yeah, and the problem with decentralized justice is that it's most of the time a who watches the watchman problem. So basically, there will always be an arbitrary choice of a protocol of scrutiny or a protocol of justice, and the arbitrary choice, albeit interesting, will be arbitrary, and so the choice of the protocol also changes the outcome of the dispute. So
Sure.
perhaps the Web3 will be something with many different types of justice, and like the logic of God, sometimes God gives a lot, sometimes God gives nothing. But for that reason, I have a concern about how regulators would accept that, because whatever one thinks of the government, of the concept of a government, the problem is that the government has to be coherent from one person to another. And
Yes.
so if there are many decentralized justice systems coexisting, a government looking for such a system would have to make an arbitrary choice that would be, of course, very criticized. And so
Sure.
this leads me to the next question. More and more of the blockchain actors, the blockchain industry actors, are working in a friendly way towards the regulators. Basically, now we're out of this cypherpunk sector, and we're not exactly in this super mainstream sector, but basically there are new regulations every week. Even the people in the industry cannot keep up with everything.
Yeah.
But for that reason, that's interesting. Do you think that trying to work in a friendly way with a regulator will make will put the whole industry at risk, because then the whole blockchain sector could lose its soul, its spirit of decentralization? Or do you envision a way for people working in this sector to keep doing great decentralized products that become mainstream, but that are not shot at by the regulators?
I mean, I think this is a really hard problem. And I think it's one that, as much as the part of me that is really sympathetic to the cypherpunk argument understands the recoil of this. Like, if people in the space who know what the tech is doing, or at least know it better than anybody else, aren't involved with the regulators, I think the odds of the outcome being good are non-existent, because who knows the regulators, the financial system, the heavy players. And if the blockchain people don't get in there and meet the regulators and talk to the regulators and work with them, we're going to get rules imposed by somebody else. And like, the reality is, like, there's an old joke that what distinguishes a language from a dialect, and the answer is an army and a navy, right? Like, it's very similar in this area. Like, it's great that we're creating computer money, but dollar bills have an army and a navy, and that is not insignificant.
And there will not be a decentralized blockchain army.
Yeah. And so we have to, that doesn't mean that the technology can't be revolutionary still. That doesn't mean it can't be game changing, but we aren't going to win a shooting war over it, So we need to not go to that space. We need to not bring about what we're doing. It doesn't mean we have to ask permission for everything, but it does mean that we need to actively engage in the political process. Going back to the dispute resolution thing, it's taken us hundreds of years to have any sort of semblance of a judicial order that kind of went outside of countries. And even now, it's not like there's a very robust system there, the International Criminal Court, The Hague, all of that stuff. There is a very much those who are powerful enough to deny their jurisdiction, I'm looking at you, US, do with impunity.
Yeah, of
And
course. Of course.
you know, and this is literally the work of hundreds of years to get to the point where there is an international criminal court where people can be, where we can put on a war crimes tribunal and all this stuff. And so these are admittedly really hard problems. And our technology, this blockchain technology, does have real potential to impact some of these things. But we can't do it if we try so hard to bring down the system that we're seen as enemies to it. Because then we just get squashed.
Of course.
And is it easy to squash blockchain? No. Is it possible? I mean, there's a lot of money and a lot of tanks out there. So I think it is possible. You know what I mean?
Sometimes people talk about the... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, just I think that we have to think about what places there is real need for regulation in our industry and what places there is real need to make sure that the regulation empowers innovation in our industry and try to strike a good balance between those two. Because, we've been in I've been in the crypto space long enough to see that there's a lot of just outright scams. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's gotten somewhat better, but there's still a lot of it there. And the fact that so much of the ecosystem and so much of what's happening is driven by the DeFi portion, which is an admittedly and self-identifying group of degens, right? They are risk takers. They're enormous risk takers, and that's fine for what they're doing because they're in a risk industry where quantifying and profiting from risk is enormous. But if we want our tech to be more far-reaching than just this, high-end casino, we've got to think more broadly, and we've got to think about how to evaluate a risk-taking opportunity from a fraud, and how do we deal with these protocols that are rug pulls and all sorts of nonsense scamminess. And those are legitimate issues. Are they overstated a lot of times? Yeah, of course. They absolutely are. And it circles back to our conversation about wallets and stuff, right? It takes you half an hour to set up a wallet. It takes you another 20 to 30 minutes a lot of times to link with the protocol you want to. So you may have been defrauded by somebody with a rug pull scam, but you put a solid hour of work into getting defrauded by yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there is an aspect of it that you are opting into the risk here in a way that you're not always doing. You know what I mean? So are some of those risks overblown? Of course, but that doesn't mean that they won't be used or useful for regulators trying to come after us. And if we don't speak up and say, hey, here's the great stuff, here's the cool stuff, here's the stuff we want to see and need to see more of, and here are the bad actors, here is misbehavior, here is stuff that shouldn't be allowed and should be regulated against, then we're going to end up with some system that's just made by banks to protect themselves.
Of course.
And that's going to be the worst outcome, I think.
In risk analysis, there's this concept, they call it the strategy of the fly. If you're a little fly and you want to destroy a porcelain shop, you cannot do it on your own. But you can really piss off an elephant and drive it towards the shop. Right. And that's what terrorism is, basically. You're hoping that there's going to be a new deal of the cards on the table because you pissed off some elephant country and you had nothing to lose with the new deal, so let's piss off the elephant. And many wars are based on this. So the blockchain is probably subjected to many of these little flies, and let's stay friendly with the elephant.
Yeah. And blockchain is built by a bunch of engineers and by a bunch of really bright, mathematically minded, engineering minded people. And they're often very idealistic. And while this part is not generalizable, it's not uncommon for them to not be really focused on approaching problems from the level of people. Like, they see the problems of the blockchain as problems that can be overcome by code and by math. And there are some of those, but like the weakest link of security in the world right now is already people. It's not going to stop being people. You know what I mean? Like the security of your computer is already the least secure where you touch it. So we've already surpassed where we are as people on this.
Of course.
So to really get to a place where there is any sort of better security, what we need to think more about is people. We need to think about how to build for people, make things that make sense for people. And like, 100-digit alphanumeric wallet addresses are effective for machines, but they are not effective for people. And it's not, there's obviously a lot of people working on a lot of problems, but I think that this focus on how to make this really fantastic and potentially revolutionary tech function for people, and people who don't have PhDs in computer science especially, is something that's always at the front of my mind, and something that I think is going to be absolutely necessary for the tech to realize any part of the potential that it may have.
Okay, so this is very interesting because we have the point of view of people who don't come from the developer side. But
Sure.
that's the same in cybersecurity. Usually, you have very competent people who are very proud of their 128 bits security key, and in the end, there's just a guy who came with a yellow jacket and a helmet in the building and who just managed to pass the security door just by doing good old gating.
Absolutely. And like, those are much harder problems to solve because there are not a limited number of variables, like the complexity of the real world comes into this. And there are things you can do to move the needle one way or another, but it's admittedly a challenge, and it takes a lot of work and iteration and refinement to get the system to knock the corners off enough to make it really useful and safe and simple enough for people to make it part of their daily lives if they're not like, if they don't have a specialized interest already in it,
And so, how would you describe the challenges the whole sector is going to face? Well, how would you describe the bunch of challenges the sector is going to face soon? Not necessarily from a regulatory point of view, but because we're now leaving the very funny part where we're doing something, jury-rigging pieces of code together and trying to convince much bigger actors to use the blockchain. What's the most dangerous thing for the sector for you?
The most dangerous thing for the sector. I guess I think the most dangerous thing right now is probably the bigger fight over encryption that's been going on for years now. And it relates because we're at the cusp of, central banks launching digital currencies. And like, I think that is going to be that's going to be really game changing. I don't know that it's necessarily for the better. It seems unlikely that the central banks are going to want to anonymize what happens with those digital currencies.
Of course.
Deeply. And that means that, like, we've mostly, if we're, living our lives online, we've mostly gotten used to like Amazon and Facebook and Google knowing everything about our financial lives. But we haven't gotten used to governments knowing all of that. And that is an entirely different ballgame. And I think there will be real changes to, if we do not insist on some measures for anonymity and privacy being implemented in these currencies, I think we're at risk of a really dystopian future, where nothing you do is ever truly private, where no transaction you make is ever secret, and where, like, I mean, one of the things you deal with as a lawyer, right, is like going back in time to try to recreate what happened at some moment of conflict or disagreement. And it is hard. People are terrible about this. Like, the way human memory works, we all think of it as a video, but it isn't. Like, you actually model it in your mind every time. You generate, the memory is generated.
Yeah, you see yourself doing this stuff, so obviously this is a reconstruction.
Like, it is not a video that you're replaying. Like, your brain is taking the elements that it recalls of that and reassembling them. And that's how false memories can come to be in everything. What that means is that, like, we all trust our memories because it's what we have, but it is a very imperfect tool. And if we are faced with machines that actually have perfect memories in a place where every decision we make is documented and fully traceable, and that documentation is done by a government, I am very, very concerned about our ability to trust that government's ability to not, like, try to do things for our own good that end up being deeply, deeply harmful and tragic. And I think that's the biggest fight that we don't talk enough about, really. Like, we're so worried about whether this is is it a utility token, like all of these things about the minor regulators, but like
that's a trivial subject compared to that.
The heavy hitters are on the threshold right now. Like, a digital dollar is a game changer in DeFi. Like, and if that digital dollar comes with the central bank tracking where every one of those dollars ever goes and knowing exactly who they went to and when and for what, that is a complicated and, I think, very dystopian future. We need to push against that. We need to insist on things that anonymize and protect and encrypt, and insist that we should have privacy for these transactions. We should not have to disclose every transaction we've ever had, because there are so many ways for an overzealous state to just run completely wild with that granularity of information about your life. Nobody will remember every transaction they made 10 years ago. And if they're asked questions about it, like, they will go wrong. Like, if they are forced to answer questions about it, they're going to trip themselves up. And that, in the circumstance of a state complaining about transactions you made years ago, that's a real problem. And they're going to have irrefutable proof of whatever you did, because it's on the blockchain forever, right? But we need to do something so that that isn't what world we wake up to when the central bank digital currencies come into play.
Of course.
That's, I think, for me, the biggest issue in the space right now. And I think it's not getting nearly enough airplay. People are talking about it a little bit, but, like, I don't think there's nearly enough warning about what this could be like if we are not very outspoken and very strident and very confident when we talk about what our tech can empower, both for the good and also for the bad, if we don't build it safely and correctly.
Yeah, that's a very deep problem. And, you know, it reminds me of news that I've read at the beginning of this week doing my market research. I saw that the Chinese Yuan, so the digital equivalent of the dollar, but in China, is likely to have an expiration date, so that you cannot save money. You can't scrimp and save and, you know, use that money to have capital to build a company, or maybe to just save something for a plane ticket and leave the country. Yeah. So when I saw that, I thought to myself, oh, that escalated very quickly. You have to be very careful about those toys.
No, absolutely. Like, I mean, like, in the US, there's this history of company towns, right? Where, like, I mean, the version I remember the most is, like, these coal towns where everybody would be paid only in $2 bills. And then they would only be able to buy all their stuff at the company store. And a lot of them, because they're coal mine owned towns, the coal mine owns all the land. They build the houses, they build the store. And, like, I understand that at least for some of those, most of the profitability was actually from running and owning the towns, not even the coal they were mining. It was because they were the butcher, they were the baker, they were the candlestick maker. Everything you bought had to come from them, and they gave you the money, but you had to give it back to them. And like a digital currency, a centralized digital currency gives a government the power to do exactly that to everybody in its jurisdiction at the same time. They can say, oh yeah, we're going to turn it off for you. You aren't allowed to keep this. It's going to expire if you keep it for too long. You can't save it. You can't buy that sort of thing, or you can't keep that sort of thing if you did buy it. And there's all sorts of ways that can be justified in the name of protecting some group or the children or whatever. Like there's always an excuse for why one freedom or another needs to be taken. But if they have the power of like literally your entire financial life, like that's something that our world has never seen before.
Yeah, they own you.
Like, if they do, you are a serf at that point, and that is something I think we should work hard to avoid.
Thank you so much for this very deep insight. And to close this interview, because this is something I ask from everyone, but
yeah,
from somebody at MuKn, I will ask more than once.
Right.
What are the projects in the oven for MuKn?
Yeah, like it's actually a really exciting time for MuKn. You know, when it started, it was like I said, like I was Francois' attorney, and we were kind of like I was just a lawyer, and like then we bootstrapped along, and now things are really starting to take off for us. We are joining the Laconic network, and that is something I'm really excited about. Laconic network is a decentralized data availability provider focusing first on Ethereum, but it's multi-chain, and it is going to be able to provide validated and verified data for Ethereum, for decentralized applications, or anybody who wants that sort of like history of Ethereum data, which is currently a nightmare to get. MuKn is in talks with a major bank, and we're not at liberty to disclose the name of that, but we've got a very exciting project in the works with a major bank. And one of our most exciting things, I think, right now in the near term is we are starting to get some real traction for our formal specification and verification services. Those are pretty technical, you know. It's using high-level math to prove qualities about programs. And like the specification side is like, does the logic of your program make sense, broadly speaking? Do the way you've designed things, is that decent? Is that secure? And is it logical? And if you get into the formal verification, it's actually being able to prove large numbers of qualities about this piece of code can or will always operate that way, or will never operate that way, this way, and actually having this mathematical rigor on code that can give a lot of assurances, and I think is a huge part of creating this blockchain space for real people. Like Francois has a story he tells about an early days at a conference where he watched two ETH devs talking to each other, and like they if you've spoken to him about blockchain security at all, you've heard this story. Like as they were sitting there, one of them was like, oh, I just sent $15,000 to the wrong address. And he kind of just shrugged it off like it was no big deal.
Whoopsie.
Like, yeah, you know, it was like, and it probably wasn't for him. Like this was routine for an early blockchain developer. Like sometimes you send stuff to the wrong address. It sucks, but what are you going to do? And the thing that's kind of funny about that to me is like for the DeFi crowd, for, you know, like my brother is a high frequency trader. Like for those guys, writing off $15,000 literally is just like, you know, oh, it's been 15 minutes. That happens. You know what I mean? Sometimes it goes your way. Sometimes you lose. That's fine. You just write that off. For like the bicycle shop on your corner, like $15,000 is whether or not that store stays open or not.
Of course.
You know what I mean? Like I kind of brought the margin.
It can be a month's income.
Yeah. And so we can't allow there to be that kind of ease to make errors of that size. We need to make the granularity of the errors a lot smaller before we can have broad adoption. And that's what I find so exciting about the formal specification and formal verification. If we're going to be able to provide security at these higher resolutions where we can narrow what those potential downside risks are for people, we need this kind of formality and structure. And they're not magic bullets. They won't solve everything, but I think they're a huge step to getting the level of protection that we need for people who don't have the risk tolerance or frankly, the financial capability to just like shrug at losing $15,000.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexander. See, the interview went just fine. Any last word?
No, thanks, Conte. It was great. It's always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This was Mutual Knowledge. My guest was Alexander Smart, Chief Executive Officer of Mutual Knowledge Systems, aka MuKn. Please like, share, and subscribe, and come back.
Thank you very much for having me, and I suspect we'll speak again.